This is Dead Rising. The game launched one of Capcom's highest-selling franchises, which is quite a feat considering the company's many iconic IPs. But it shouldn't really be surprising to anyone that has actually played Dead Rising and experienced the uniquely challenging gameplay and unmistakably fun tone. What might be surprising, however, is just how badly Capcom has treated the Dead Rising franchise over the years, and how quickly it was written off by players. The original Dead Rising came out on the Xbox 360 in 2006, and it really shows. It had everything early 2000s gamers wanted: a smart talking protagonist,
keep him busy dodging your bullets and stay out of trouble. Are you up to it?
I'm a lot better with a camera. But yeah, I'll give it a shot.
brutal violence, questionable yet hilarious jokes,
Clean up! Register 6!
and zombies. And to make it even better, the whole thing took place in a shopping mall. You can't get much more 2000s than that. And while the familiar iconography and sense of humor of the time period was definitely a draw for gamers, there was also substance to Dead Rising's style. Dead Rising's 72-hour timeline, which was 6 hours of real-time gameplay, saw photojournalist Frank West corralling apocalypse survivors into the mall's security room before heading to the roof of the building at the end of the game to be airlifted to safety. Or not, depending on how many people Frank saved and various other plot-related objectives players might have missed. The game itself was essentially a sandbox with a time limit, and the only goal outside of completing the main story was to mow down zombies and memorable bosses with bizarre weapons while wearing the most outlandish outfit you could find. Players could use Frank's photojournalism background to complete photography challenges, as well as just take pictures around the mall for fun. It was pure chaos, and it was glorious.
Behold! The end of the world is upon us!
While Dead Rising was met with fairly positive reviews on release, the biggest point of contention was the game's save system. Players could only save their progress at specifically designated areas, that being in the mall's bathrooms and on the bench in the security room. Now, obviously this wasn't ideal for a lot of casual players, but it was compounded by that ever-ticking countdown and the overall difficulty of the game. While the in-depth leveling system meant that there was a lot of room for replayability, Dead Rising was set in an open world. This meant that it was very easy to accidentally wander into a boss room or get swarmed by a horde of zombies early on. Some players struggled to progress, and because of the less than reliable AI, they also lost a lot of potential NPC survivors. Nevertheless, Dead Rising built up a respectable fan base and sold over 1 million copies in its first year on store shelves. It even made enough money to get an absolutely atrocious Wii remake 3 years later, which restructured the mission system to restrict the open world and got rid of the game's photography system entirely. But the charm of the original Xbox 360 version of Dead Rising and the uniqueness of the gameplay was more than enough to sustain a lot of players. So Capcom started developing a proper sequel, or rather, Capcom passed off development of a proper sequel to one of their subsidiaries. Capcom was pretty busy with those other aforementioned iconic IPs and didn't have a lot of time to focus on Dead Rising. So Capcom Vancouver, formerly known as Blue Castle Games, was given the franchise because they had figured out a way to get more zombies on screen at one time, at least according to one former developer. They would go on to create Dead Rising 2, which would release for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC in 2010. A lot of the original flavor of the first game stuck around for the sequel. There was a major focus on zombie killing, bosses, and leveling up. The time limit persisted, as did the save system, and it was just as chaotic and fun. Photojournalist Frank West was no longer the protagonist, instead being replaced by former motocross champ Chuck Green, which meant the photography system was removed. But what the game lost with Frank and his camera, DR2 more than made up for it in added features and general improvements. The game looked better than its predecessor, and the story was surprisingly sweet.
Nobody likes shots, honey. But it's very important that you get this.
Players could invite their friends along for a competitive or cooperative multiplayer experience, and the weapon system was upgraded dramatically by the ability to put together certain objects to make some absolutely unhinged combinations. The game was pretty broken at launch, which meant that early review scores were hobbled significantly. But DR2 would still go on to sell more than 2 million copies in just over a year. and the game's 2 bits of DLC, Case Zero and Case West, would help soften the blow of those glitches and performance issues. Weirdly, in the midst of this success, Capcom would also release a Dead Rising mobile spin-off that was widely hated for being bad, boring, and ugly, not unlike that Wii remake of the original that we saw in 2009. And then in 2011, we saw the release of Dead Rising 2 Off the Record. Off the Record was a tongue-in-cheek non-canon spin-off of DR2, once again featuring Frank West. It sounds like a good idea in theory, particularly given the sense of humor the games had at the time, but in reality it felt slightly lazy and particularly unimaginative. In hindsight, these were warning signs for the fate of the Dead Rising franchise. Capcom Vancouver would return to Dead Rising for its 3rd official installment in 2013. Dead Rising 3 was a Microsoft exclusive, only releasing on Xbox One and PC, and is barely recognizable as part of the franchise. The game changed up its main character to a mechanic named Nick Ramos. On normal difficulties, it no longer featured a timer or location-based save points, and given the time Dead Rising 3 released in, there was no escaping that gritty realism that plagued the industry, especially for zombie games trying to align themselves with the Walking Dead TV show. DR3 was a lot less fun, colorful, and charming. It had become much more serious and dark, both in tone and color scheme. While there was still some fun to be had in chopping up zombies, this shift in style made DR3 indistinguishable from the other releases in the 2010s, and it only managed to sell about 1 million copies in a year, less than half what DR2 sold. The baffling decision by Capcom to go back to being a Microsoft exclusive probably had a lot to do with Dead Rising 3's sales numbers, but its lack of innovation cannot be discounted as a failure on the part of the developers. At the time, it seemed like they were simply chasing trends. Sure, they added vehicle customization, but very little else was done to make the game stand out like the original had, with its risky timer, difficult gameplay, photo system, and unapologetic focus on fun. For a lot of fans, after the release of DR3, there wasn't much enthusiasm left for the series. Expectations for a possible new installment were at an all-time low. That is, until Dead Rising 4's 2016 announcement trailer. It looked like DR4 was back with a tremendous return to form. Frank West was returning as the protagonist, his photo system was coming along with him, and with stunning next-gen graphics. From the trailer alone, players were rejoicing. The Dead Rising series had been reanimated and would live again. But after it shambled on to the Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and PC, it became clear for a lot of players that this wasn't the triumphant return many had hoped for. Capcom Vancouver had officially lost their touch. The series' trademark time limit was non-existent again. Multiplayer was still there, but co-op wasn't an option, and everything from the inventory system to how the zombies behaved was streamlined and simplified for a smoother, less challenging experience. Like every Dead Rising game to come before, the 4th installment had plenty of ways to kill zombies, but the world itself was bland. Frank felt like a toothless shell of himself.
Yes, Vic, I am all the evils in the world.
Well, you did leave a helpless man tied up in a dark room 20 feet from a live firefight.
Whatever, he was fine.
And even the boss battles were stripped of most of their personality and memorability. There was nothing new or imaginative in DR4. It was more of the same, but with the removal of the key features that made the series what it was. As a result, it got the lowest reviews of the main series and couldn't even sell 1 million copies in its first year, which marked not only the death of the franchise, but also the closure of Capcom Vancouver. There was actually supposed to be a 5th game, but because of Dead Rising 4's poor performance, Capcom shut down the studio and all plans for the continuation of the franchise. In the end, the Dead Rising series was completely aimless. It had no sense of direction or purpose. Features and well-loved systems were altered or entirely removed. This was seemingly done at random, but it was more likely done in an effort to appeal to a larger mainstream gaming audience. And that may have been Capcom's biggest mistake. By attempting to appeal to everyone, they appealed to no one. There is a legion of hardcore Dead Rising fans out there who adore the limited time frame, punishing open world, ridiculous humor, and general chaos. Changing those core components made Dead Rising into a generic store-brand version of itself that may have worked for some people, but clearly didn't work well enough to keep the franchise alive. Over the years, we've seen remakes and remasters of the original games pop up for PlayStation consoles, and those versions of the games are really well reviewed. Dead Rising still has a chance of rising again. As long as Capcom understands that it's okay to make games that aren't for absolutely everyone, we could get a 5th game that's every bit as wild and fun and distinctive as the original. Just don't start the countdown for it, because there's no guarantee we'll ever be airlifted out of mediocrity.
I really thought that would work.
Well, that is it for this episode. What do you think? Will we see more Dead Rising games, or is the franchise dead forever? Let us know in the comments down below, and as always, like and subscribe to Nerdstalgic Gaming for more content just like this.